my God, we thank you for a new day with a new study. We pray you would be with us as we look at the book of Joshua and begin a new series. Amen.
Amen. And we thank you, God, for Alexander.
Amen. Thank you.
Amen.
Yes. Amen.
So we're going to do a little introduction of the book of Joshua and do a little bit of review of some things about the Old Testament, which I hope will make sense as we kind of get into Joshua. But this is our new series that we're going to look at. So we're doing Joshua. Right after Joshua, we will do the book of Judges. And sort of the subtitle, if you will, for our study is Covenant to Chaos. I will come back to that, why we're calling it Covenant to Chaos, and talk about Judges later in our presentation. But first, I want to look at the schedule just so that you all know what is coming up. Today, we're going to do an introduction and an overview of the book of Joshua. I did not have time to finish my book summary. I almost finished it this morning, and then I had to record a few videos. And so I did not get that done. But next week, I will also have a handout that's like the book summary with a lot of the information we'll look at today on it. Next week, read Joshua's 1 and 2. Come into class with that. Pre-read would be great. And this is what we will look at. Just as a note, I will be out of town at the end of the month. And so Mother Amy is going to come in and talk about women in the Old Testament because we are looking at Joshua. And after that, we will look at Judges. And there are lots of men in all of those and not a lot of women. And so I asked Mother Amy if she could be a woman to come into class. And she said, I can show up as a woman. And so I said, great, okay. And I think she will teach that week a lot better. So she will not do every woman in the Old Testament, but she'll hit some of the highlights. So that will be a fun day. I won't be here. I will be at a conference. We will do the book of Joshua until spring break. We will not meet that week. And then after spring break, we will begin the book of Judges. I'm hoping to get that lined up to like mid-May when there's like all of the graduation weeks. And so we'll have like a week or two break there at the end of May as everyone will be kind of out of town and everything. After we do Judges, we might do a few weeks of a special topic, something New Testament, and then we will do the book of Genesis. And that will be the last book that I teach here because I will be moving in August to go to seminary. And so, but that is like, we will still have class in the summer, and we will end with where this class began, the book of Genesis, which was only 6 people. And so most of you were not here for that. And so that will be fun.
Where are you going to seminary?
To Seminary of the Southwest in Austin, Texas, which is where Bo Townsend went. Cal Calhoun is the only other priest in this diocese that went there. But Pat Wingo and Sarah Scott went there too, which I've heard someone told me that. I don't remember who it was because I did not realize that. Today's word of the day is obedience. Bonus points if you count how many times the word obedience is mentioned, because I have no idea. And so, but that will continue to pop up. Natalie, do you need a bookmark?
Is there somebody sitting here?
No, that's just a pile of handouts.
All right, I can have that.
Yes.
I can have a bookmark. Thank you. And I need a bookmark.
Oh, you need a bookmark? I was very happy.
Thank you.
Christopher had a vestry book because he's getting ready for the retreat. And he opened it up to a page and he had one of the bookmarks. And I was like, yeah. So we're going to go ahead and begin the presentation. This is the part that says Intro to the Hebrew Bible, if you're following along in your notes. I want you to just know that the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament, is made up of 3 main parts. And so for Jews, they call that the Torah, which is the law. That's the first 5 books. There is the Nevi'im, which is the prophets, and the Ketuvim, which is the writings. And so sometimes you might hear someone say the word Tanakh. That's like an acronym for Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. And so Joshua serves as this bridge. He's a bridge between the Torah and the prophets. And so the Torah, the first 5 books, those books that Traditionally, we say Moses wrote and introduced us into the covenant with God. Joshua serves as that bridge that goes to the prophets. And the prophets are kind of the next layer around the Torah. We have been given the law. We've been given the instruction. And when you think Torah, don't just think rigid rules. The root word for Torah, it's the guidepost that you would use out in the desert. So, you don't have concrete in interstates, so they would make long pillars. Oftentimes those pillars would include the king's laws. Think like the Law Code of Hammurabi would have these pillars there. But you're out in the desert, and you could see over the horizon that pillar, and that's how you knew where to go. It's the guidepost that you live by. That's what the Torah is. And the prophets further explain how to live according to the Torah. Joshua serves as this bridge. We've been given the law. Now we're beginning to live out the law, if you will. And so that is that summary.
So they weren't prophesying?
They also were, but they are expounding upon the law as well. The law is the central, is the core piece. Hi, Beverly. We're going to look here about the authors. This might be review for some of you, and if you are someone who blanks out at extra nerdy stuff, let me just give you one summary point. When scholars look at the first 5 books, they say there are various sources that make it up. We can summarize all of that really complicated, nerdy stuff and say there's one of those that's priestly, there's one of those that's non-priestly. That makes up Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And then the book of Deuteronomy, can you take a guess what source that might be from? It's from the Deuteronomists. Yeah, they're not that creative at naming things because they name stuff like I do. And so the Deuteronomist source makes up the book of Deuteronomy. And that's important to note because the book of Joshua is a part of that. It comes from that school. And it shares a lot of similar perspectives to it. The Deuteronomist view, if you will, is essentially that anyone can follow God if you follow the Torah or follow the law. Joshua is carrying up that same point of view. And do you remember our word of the day?
Obedience.
Obedience. That's a very heavy theme throughout the book of Joshua. Anyone can follow the God if you follow Torah. You could be Joshua. You could be any other family. You could be any other Israelite. You could even be a Canaanite tribe. Anyone can follow God if you follow the Torah. So hold on to that as a line. That is a prevalent theme throughout the book. It's about obedience. Here's a chart that kind of shows that. So here are these books that are made up of these non-priestly and priestly sources. But you'll see Deuteronomy is carrying out in these other books like Joshua and Judges, Samuel and Kings. They're all part of that same school. They have that same perspective. Anyone can follow God if you follow the Torah. Any questions on that? Okay. This is a chart you've seen before about when the Bible was written. I'm going to zoom in on the part that has Joshua, just because it's fun to know. So like here's Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. Also the book of Jeremiah is in that same sort of school of thought. Anyone can follow God if you follow the Torah, which has a different focus than like the book of Isaiah. And so if you read Jeremiah, you might catch some of the similar themes and such as you read it. None of that is very important, but it's just good for you to hold on to. On your notes, so this part that I say origin story, the 3 patriarchs, that's where it says Genesis, if you want to take notes. There's one way of looking at the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and it's kind of like you have 2 main sets of heroes. And so the first kind of like the origin story of the heroes of the 3 patriarchs is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob later gets renamed to Israel. That's found in the book of Genesis. Genesis is the Hebrew word for beginning. It's how the Bible begins. In the beginning, God created the world. And so Genesis 1 through 11, it's sort of a history of the whole world. We're going to go through Adam, We're going to talk about Eve, and then we're going to go through the history of how the whole world came to be as it is. And we have to get through this because the real crux of Genesis really begins in chapter 12 with the calling of Abraham. And that's when we meet the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we will meet them. God will come to Abraham in Genesis 12 and says, I will make a nation out of you, and you will become a blessing to the whole world. And there is a small covenant. It's not the covenant like the Mosaic covenant with the law, but there's like a proto version of that. That is the covenant of circumcision with Abraham. And then we end up in Egypt. And it's important that we end up in Egypt because we need to get to the story of Moses, and Moses has to get us out of Egypt. And so that is sort of what that is about. The story of Moses, kind of the origin stories of Moses, includes the book of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And we're going to do a one-sentence summary of all three of those books. Because the book of Exodus is going to begin with leaving Egypt. We, in English, we call the book of Exodus, Exodus. And so we think the whole book is just about the Exodus. That's only half the book. The other half is about the building of the tabernacle. And so it actually gets built like 3 times, if you remember when we read the book of Exodus, because God's like, I'm going to tell you to build this tabernacle. Now I want you to build this tabernacle, and then the tabernacle gets built. And in the ancient world, you don't highlight, you can't underline. So if you repeat something, it says, this is important. And that's really what the book of Exodus is about. We're getting out of Egypt, and now we have a place where we can worship God. But the book ends on almost a sad note, because Moses is not able to enter into the tabernacle. So now the question is, well, I built this tabernacle to worship God. Well, how do I use it? And that's what the book of Leviticus is all about. Leviticus begins that God calls to Moses from within the tabernacle. Moses is out there. God is inside the tabernacle. God's in the tabernacle. And you could almost think about the book of Leviticus as this like one continuous speech from God to Moses to share with all of Israel for how they can become ritually pure and holy and enter the tabernacle. That's Leviticus in a summary. The book of Numbers is exciting. I like the book of Numbers. And it begins, no longer is like God and Moses separated. Now Moses is inside the tabernacle talking to God. Oh, now we're in the tabernacle. But then the question becomes, wait, we have a place to worship God, this tabernacle, but where are we going to live? And that's what the book of Numbers is all about. It's about getting to the promised land. But Moses messes it up. And Moses is not allowed to go into the promised land because of some of the stuff he does throughout the story. And so we spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness, waiting. And the book ends right outside of the promised land, about to cross the river. The book of Deuteronomy is going to retell all of Moses' stories and writings, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. It's going to do it from a little different perspective. Remember, what's the point of the Deuteronomist? Anyone can follow God if you follow the Torah. Our word for the day is obedience. So if we are obedient, we could have been in the land earlier. So we're waiting for this new obedient leader to get us in the land. And the reason I'm telling you all of this is because Joshua is that next book. We are finally going to be allowed to enter the land. And that asks a question of us. And this is going to be a question we will ask throughout the book of Joshua. Am I obedient or disobedient? Will I follow God's law? That's the question we're going to ask of ourselves throughout Joshua. We will even ask it of Joshua. Okay, any questions on that? Yes?
Why wasn't Moses allowed in the tabernacle?
Okay, sorry. I thought you were going to say into the promised land. He wasn't allowed into the tabernacle because he was not ritually holy yet. And because they didn't have the book of Leviticus yet to know what sacrifices and all to do.
Because they didn't have the law.
Because they didn't have the law yet. Good question. Any other questions on that?
So why wasn't he allowed to the promised land since we're on that subject?
Primarily because he got angry and hit a rock. when God told him to go up to this rock to give water. The Israelites were complaining. They're like, "We had it better in Egypt. At least we could eat and drink water." And Moses is like, "You guys are so annoying. I get it, especially with our toddlers right now." Like, and so he smacks this rock, and it makes it look like it's Moses' own power. There's some. That's primarily it. It's like he did not obey. He wasn't obedient. That gets us to Joshua and Judges. Ooh, Joshua is fun. It's a fun book. We'll get to some other stuff about Joshua in a minute, but the summary point is that Joshua is this new Moses. And so where Moses was not obedient, Joshua is. And so our word, like kind of for Joshua, is covenant. Joshua follows the covenant. For the most part, Joshua does everything right. Like, he is better than Moses was. We have been given this law of how to worship God. We have built a tabernacle, and we can go in there and worship God. And as a reminder, the tabernacle is like a proto-temple. So the temple was made out of brick. The tabernacle was a mobile temple before they could build the full-on temple. But now we have a land to go in and worship God. We need someone to lead us into that promised land that God gave us from way back in the story of Abraham. He said, "I'll make a nation. I will give you this land." And Joshua leads us into it. He follows that covenant. The book ends when Joshua is an old man, and he's not the one that's going to rule anymore. And so we go into the time of the judges. And this is the time of chaos. Any judges that you can remember? Samuel was a judge that comes later, right when we get to the monarchy. He's not in the book of Judges, but he's a good judge and prophet.
Well, it was easier for Joshua to follow the rules because there were rules, whereas with Moses, there hadn't been rules yet. So.
Yeah, and Moses got angry too. Joshua also makes mistakes, and it's one of the things I love about reading the Hebrew Bible is it shows how we can be broken and still follow God too, because they're really messed up. Like Samson. Do you remember what Samson does? Yes. So he had the rule that was bik because he was a Nazarene, which meant no body. I can't remember. This was we had this as an acronym in college. I don't know, but he wasn't allowed to shave, or cut his hair. He wasn't allowed to drink, and he was not supposed to touch a dead body. And in the story of Samson, he does all three of those things. And to make it worse, he had one calling, which was to get rid of the Philistines, and that was his girlfriend. And so, Samson's supposed to be this judge to lead Israel, and he sucks at it. Do you remember Gideon? Do you remember what Gideon does? So, yeah, all of these Philistine and Canaanite kings come up, and they're surrounded Israel to destroy Israel. And Gideon collects this large army, and then God's make it smaller, smaller, and smaller until he has 300 people, and they surround the camp, and they don't even use their swords. They bang their swords on the shields, and they break their pots and wave lanterns, and the armies end up killing all of themselves because they're scared. And Gideon is like, "Look how great I am, guys. Let's make a statue to me." And so that's what the book of Judges is. We're seeing that Joshua follows the covenant, does it really well, but Joshua doesn't live forever. And we get to the Judges, and it's chaos. Everyone keeps breaking it. And that's going to lead us to, we need a king who's going to come. Because I'm a Christian, that's Jesus. And so you could say it's covenant to chaos, and in parentheses, it leads us to Christ. Because we're waiting for this Jesus to come. And again, this is about obedience, our word of the day. Okay, let's take a look at who Joshua was. His name in Hebrew is Yeshua. I'm probably saying that wrong, and that's okay, because we speak English and we say Joshua. But his name is an acronym of two words. Yah, which is the word for Yahweh, God's name, and Yasha, which is to save. It means God saves. Fun enough, if you take that from Hebrew and go through Latin, you end up getting the word Jesus, which is Jesus. But in Hebrew, it's the same name. Joshua and Jesus are they're the exact same name. It's just gone through another language to get Jesus. That's going to become important when we get to, we'll say why he's important. Just remember, it's the same name as Jesus. He was from the tribe of Ephraim. Oh, let me just do one tell you about this icon in case I forget later. A lot of the icons for Joshua will say like holy and righteous, like the holy righteous Joshua. He's like a big deal. He's a good example to follow. Remember, he's obedient. He follows the covenant. He was from the tribe of Ephraim, the son of Nun. So he's from a different tribe than Moses was. He was Moses' second in command. One of the times we really begin to see the transition to him as a leader is when Moses is leading Israel against the battle of the Amalekites, who in the story are these big giants and stuff. And Moses has to hold up his staff to win the battle. And so, because he's holding up his staff, he can't be out there leading the army. And Joshua does that. And we see that a lot in the book of Numbers, this transition to Joshua as the leader. We first meet him way back, I think it's Exodus 33. If you remember when they come up to the promised land and Moses sends 12 spies representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, say, hey guys, yeah, we can go in there and do what God said. And the other 10 are like, guys, like those people are giants. They're like taller than, I don't know, the biggest NBA basketball player. The grapes are bigger than Alexander. Like, it is a fruitful land, but like there's no way that we can go in there. And Joshua's like, guys, God said we can do it. And they don't. That's another reason Moses does not get to enter the land, because he said, okay, we won't go in there. And they had to wait 40 years. And that whole generation dies off except Joshua and Caleb. They are the only ones from that generation that make it. Caleb, we won't talk about him a lot, but just because it's fun. When they finally do come in and enter the land, and Joshua's like, Caleb, what does your family want? He's like, you can have the best pick of any land. And Caleb is like, I'll take those hard, pointy rocks over there up on that mountain. And he's like 90 years old and like climbs up the mountain with his family. Just kind of fun. But that's when we meet Joshua. You're like, yeah, that's fun. You're weird. We'll talk about this picture in a minute, but Joshua is important because he's presented as this new Moses. Okay, so he is the successor to Moses, but also when Moses made mistakes, Joshua is a better Moses. He's better than Moses was in this terms of being obedient and stuff. And there's a couple examples throughout too that makes these parallels between them. Just some of them, some of my favorites. When Moses splits the Red Sea, if you remember in the Exodus, and all of Israel passes through, as they come up to the land, Joshua splits the river, and Israel passes through. And that's the story where they set up the Ebenezer stones to remember. And I love that story. You've heard me talk about it before. There's also this really cool story about the angel that Joshua meets. If you remember that Moses talks to God for the first time in the burning bush, essentially Joshua gets to talk to God through this scene with the angel. It's in Joshua chapter 5. They are about to begin the conquest and the wars and stuff as they come into the land of Canaan. And Joshua is like, he's pepping himself up. I can do this. And suddenly there's this angel of the Lord that's there. This divine figure, looks scary and everything. And Joshua looks to him and he says, are you on our adversary's side, or are you on my side, or our side? And the angel looks at him and he says, neither. I am the angel of the Lord's army. And you get this question, and we'll talk about this more today, but the question is, it's not, is God on my side? The question is, am I on God's side? And that serves as a very good reminder for Joshua as this begins. It's not God who works for Joshua. It's Joshua who works for God. To make that into some of today's terms, when I pray, God help my football team win, I am trying to put God onto my side. And that's a silly example, but we also do that like, God help my nation win, or God help my this win. That's me putting God onto my side. The question is not, is God on my side? It's, am I on God's side? And that will be a very important part. We'll come back and talk about that later. There's another parallel story with Moses and Joshua. Moses sends in the 12 spies. Joshua sends in 2 spies to come into the land. we'll talk about them, not next week, the week after that. As we already said, Joshua serves as this transition from the Torah to the prophets. So we've been given a law. He's going to show us now how to kind of follow that really well as we get to some of the later prophets. And lastly, I'm going to take a sip of my drink. He is seen as this kind of perfect and law-abiding king and leader. We call this, I didn't put it in the notes, I meant to, so you can, if you are making notes in parentheses, say he is a type of Christ. There are figures throughout the Old Testament, throughout the Hebrew Bible, that serve as a type of Christ. That is not saying that they are a kind of Messiah or a kind of Christ, but they serve as a type, like an archetype of it. They're giving us a picture of it. Joshua is really one of our first pictures of who this Messiah is that God is going to send. David is another one. He's a very big type of Christ, showing us who this Messiah is, this good law-abiding king and spiritual leader. And so Joshua is a big deal. And so you start to get it when you see icons that say holy and righteous Joshua. It makes sense as you go through the story. Any questions on Joshua as a person? Okay, now we're going to talk about Joshua as a book. And I will get to this, but let me go ahead and just make a note about what we're going to do. We're going to talk about how the book of Joshua was written. We're going to talk about what is the point of Joshua. And when we get to that slide that says what is the point, I will have a slide that says disclaimer there. And there is some people that get very uncomfortable with reading the book of Joshua in particular because Joshua is primarily a military book. The word we would use today to describe what happens in Joshua is genocide, because they are going in to get rid of a people group and their culture and put in a new culture and a new people group. There's some other things with Joshua too. We are going to talk about that as like an after conversation. And so we'll talk about sort of how this book was written. We'll talk about some of the really good points throughout the book of Joshua. Like that question, are you trying to put God on your side, or are you lining up on God's side? Which is one of my favorite points of the book. And then we will watch the Bible Project video. And then after that, we will have that after conversation. And we'll talk about some more like critical scholarship stuff. And you might not want to be here for that. But just so you know, that's what we're going to do. So, Joshua, the book of Joshua. This is the new Moses leading Israel into the promised land. That's the summary of what this book is. Joshua serves as this new Moses, and he leads Israel into the land. And he's doing this because he's obedient and he's not disobedient. Obedience. The traditional author, a lot of people used to say like Joshua wrote this book. Nobody thinks Joshua really wrote this book today, like in terms of scholarship. And so we're saying it's from the Deuteronomist school. So if you were here at the beginning of the slides, the Deuteronomist school is like the same school that wrote the book of Deuteronomy. Also the book of Judges. And the point of that is anyone can follow God if you follow the law. Anyone can follow God if you follow the law. That is true of Israelites. That is true of Canaanites. That is true of women. That is true of men. That's true of children. Anyone can follow God if you follow the law. I just mentioned all of those specifics because they will pop up when we talk about what's the point. Especially Rahab, because she's there too. Also just fun about this, or I think it's fun, there's like some lost books that get mentioned as like sources to help write the book of Joshua. So there's like the book of Jasher. Nobody knows what that is. There's the book of the Wars of the Lord. That one's kind of self-explanatory. There's another book. It's mentioned in the book of Judges, but I put it here too, is the Annals of the King. And so I just think that's fun. We have all these lost books, and maybe one day someone will find a cave and will find these like old scrolls, and it will be fun. And yeah, that'd be cool. Let's talk about the setting of this book. So this book is describing events that take place in around like 1200 BCE. That's the late Bronze Age. And it's when it's the conquest of Canaan. We get that date 1200 BCE. If you say the Exodus would have happened around 1440 BCE, and the 1200s is when this is going to take place. But it's sometime in the late Bronze Age. Now, you've heard me say this before, but just like anytime you read a book, there's the time that book is about, and then there's the time when that book is written, and those are not always the same. And that's sort of true for here too. Oh, I'm going to tell you about that in a second. Forget what I just said. The setting, what this book is about. So that picture there is the fall of Jericho, because they're entering into Canaan and everything. And oftentimes the art for the book of Joshua will have these two pieces, at least the art that I just tend to like, I guess, which is the fall of Jericho is often depicted. And then the other one, and this is important, it's the carrying of the Ark of the Covenant. So just same thing, when we think about the book of Exodus, we focus on the Exodus part, but we leave out the tabernacle part. Same thing for Joshua. We focus on the conquest part, but we leave out the law part, the covenant part. The Ark of the Covenant was that box that contained the tablets of the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments. So if you remember the original ones that kind of God inscribed, Moses broke them at the burning calf, and so Moses recarved them. Those get put into the Ark of the Covenant. Some of the manna that they ate in the wilderness gets put into the Ark of the Covenant. There's a couple other items, but they're the items of spiritual significance. They're relics from when God intervened. And so the Ark of the Covenant has a big deal because if the Ark is with them, God's favor is with them, and when the Ark isn't, God's favor is not. And so it serves as a big deal too in the story. This comes from a 3rd century Bible known as the Crusaders Bible, or the Akbar Bible. I should say 13th century, I think. This is the mosaic. That's the back of our graphic. It's also on your bookmark. And you might not be able to see it very well. If you look on the back of the bookmark, you can kind of see it. Just wanted to show it to you in its full beauty. So here's the fall of Jericho. You know the song about Jericho? And the walls came tumbling down. Yeah, so that's the wall tumbling down. We'll sing that in 2 weeks. It'll be fun. And then also there's the carrying of the Ark of the Covenant. I just put that to say that we focus on the top part, but we forget about the Ark of the Covenant.
What's the word? Joshua fit the battle with Jericho? Fought the battle? What's the word?
Joshua fought the battle of Jericho. Yeah, okay, we'll wait to sing. Okay. I thought someone was going to sing with me, and I got nervous. Like we have said before, oftentimes there's the setting for the book, and then there's when that book is written. This does have some relevance, and so it's good to just keep in mind. We won't talk about it again past today, but as we do our introduction, it's good to know. It was probably written in the 7th century. This is the late Iron Age, and it's that the contemporary audience for it would be when King Josiah reconquers the northern tribes. And so if you remember who King Josiah was, he was a young sort of child king. He was like a teenager. And all of Israel has kind of forgotten about God. And so they find this scroll, and that's what this picture is. And that scroll was probably like an early version of the book of Deuteronomy. It's the scroll of the law. And Josiah reads it, and he's like, oh my gosh, we haven't followed the law. And so he helps purify Israel. In that time, there was all these high places that they were going to worship other things. This is my joke about high places, because we have found in some of these old altars, they would oftentimes be up on mountains. In their old incense blends, there would be cannabis in the incense blends. And sometimes like shrooms and stuff like that. And so in the high places, it's the high place. I think that's funny. And so Josiah's like, guys, that's not what it's about. We're going to follow the law. That's what the scroll says. And so he purifies Israel. They go back and they reconquer these northern tribes. They centralize worship into the worship that was happening at the temple, that sort of thing. And so you can see where sometimes the story of Joshua becomes important. Why it would get written down in this book that we have today, of the book of Joshua. Because it's about the right worship of God. It's about obedience. We're not worshiping at the high place. We're not using the cannabis blends. These are in Jerusalem too, like around Jerusalem. We find that, yeah. And so you can see where it pops up for here. Some of the reasons that we know that, I think I've used this as an example, but like if you were reading a book about the Civil War and it talked about a song Michael Jackson sung, and it talked about like the Texas A&M Bullhorns go up against UT Vols, and you would go, wait a second, some of those things don't match up. And so we get sometimes of those in Joshua where it's using contemporary language examples or names of places, but it's writing about this thing that happened back then. And so same thing, it'd just be like if someone wrote about New York City when the pilgrimages came, like the pilgrims came in, and you would go, it wasn't even part of York then, it was a different holding. So yeah, just a note about that. And then also it probably went through this final editing and redacting and some of the extra points throughout Joshua 2 during the exile, which is true for all of the Hebrew Bible, that it gets finished and completed when we have it during the exile. And the reason for that is because you had people who worshipped at a temple. They get carried off into exile. They're out living in another land. And it's like, how do I follow God when I don't have a temple? And so, well, we write our stories down in books. And we write down our psalms and we sing them. And we're changing to like a synagogue more type people than a people who worshipped at the temple. And that also becomes important because as you come back from exile into the land, we want to remember our history and we want to worship God the right way when we return. And so just note like these kind of three pieces, that it's writing about Joshua in the 1200s in Canaan, probably mostly written in the 7th century BCE, and then gets its kind of final editing in the exile. And the point that it has throughout there is that failure to follow the covenant is going to lead to a loss of the land. And so if you're not obedient, God's favor is not with you, you'll lose the land. And so as you're going back into the land after the exile, we need to follow God, and that becomes true for us anywhere. And that makes Joshua and that Deuteronomist kind of school important for everyone, because anyone can follow God if you follow the law. It doesn't matter if you live in Alexandria. It doesn't matter if you live in Babylon. It doesn't matter if you live in Knoxville, Tennessee. Anyone can follow God if we follow the law. Anyone can follow God. It's about obedience. I want to show you this cool picture here. Here's a larger version of it. This is from a 18th century Italian? French? Oh, I can't remember. It's French or Italian. I think this one's French. Illustrations of the Old Testament. His name is James Tizet. It's 1880s. This one was made. So here's Jerusalem up here, and so you see, some of the destruction has already kind of happened as things are knocked over. And here's the people. I'm not sure why this graphic is blurry because I had a high resolution version of it, but if I can get back to the copyright rights, I'll send it out in the email. I just love this one. It's called The Flight of the Prisoners by James Tizet, if you wanted to look it up too. And it's just a beautiful piece, particularly that like idealized Jerusalem there, and they're dusty and like washed out as they go away. And so it's just a cool one. That's not really relevant for Joshua. I just really liked that piece of art. So I'm going to move away from it there. What is the point? As I already said, we're going to have a disclaimer with the problems people have had reading Joshua, and so we'll get to that at the end after the Bible Project video if you want to stay for that. But some of the main points is that this book is about God's justice on evil, an emphasis that it's God's justice and it's on evil. The book of Joshua is not just this nationalistic agenda for Israel to claim a land. It's not presented that way. And it's not presented as just being targeted at a people group because they are part of that people group. It's about evil. And so we'll come to moments throughout the book of Joshua that sometimes these Canaanites turn to God. In the very beginning chapters, when they go into Jericho, they meet this prostitute named Rahab, and she ends up following Yahweh, following God. She's the one that shelters them. Anybody know who Rahab's son is? Is Boaz. Do you know who Boaz's wife is? Ruth. And do you know who one of their descendants is? David. And you know who one of David's descendants is? Jesus. She was a Canaanite. Whoa. Even Ruth she was also not an Israelite. And so it's not just about like getting rid of the Canaanites. It's about getting rid of evil. Okay. And so it's God's justice. It's not Joshua's justice. It's not Israel's justice. It's God's justice. And they make that very clear when you meet the angel. Are you on their side or my side? Neither. I'm on God's side. So keep that in mind as we read the book. This is also about God's promises for a home. That picture was the church on Sunday night for the Epiphany dinner. I walked out in the middle of the service to get that picture because I wanted to see the lights.
Beautiful.
It is. And think about how special it is to have a home to live in, a home to worship in. And this is something God promised way back to Abraham, like 1,000 years before this. And we get this idea that like God has been trying to make this land and the people have kept sort of messing it up. Same thing with Moses. They could have been there 40 years earlier, but because of Moses' disobedience, they have to wait a whole other 40 years. So we're finally coming home. And so there's this sense of Joshua that it's hopeful. And so if you feel like there is a lack of justice in the world or a lack of homemaking for God's kingdom, there's this sense that Joshua gives us a glimpse of that. This is also about our faithfulness to God's covenant. Remember, it's about obedience. Joshua is the holy, righteous Joshua. He is obedient. He follows the covenant. And there is this pushing for you to also follow the covenant. Remember how we talked about this is God's justice on evil. Sometimes this is centered toward the Israelites in the book of Joshua too. It's not just about the Canaanites. It's about the concept of evil and those who follow evil. And so they were not supposed to gather up the spoils of war for self-gain. There's this one guy who does, and he and his whole family get wiped out. And so it's a very strong emphasis on justice. It's a strong emphasis on our faithfulness to the covenant and on obedience. This is also ask us this question, like, am I following my agenda or God's agenda? We've already said enough about that. So a way to say that, another way, it's about obedience, obedience, obedience. Anybody kept track of how many times we said that?
You're about 8-ish.
8? Only 8? Maybe
The actual word obedience.
Obedience, 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 obedience. Okay,
Yeah,
something to
there
say. So that's sort of a glimpse of the book of Joshua. We are going to transition to watch the Bible Project video that will give us a summary of it and walk through some of it. It will also talk about some of that, the problems with the war and everything. Any questions, though, on the book? Yeah.
Really quick, I hope. I'm just curious. I've heard certainly reference to lost books before, but where do we get those names from? I've never heard those names.
Right here in the text.
It's in the text.
Yeah.
Joshua,
And so,
it's going to say Jasher, Wars of the Lord, and Amos of the King.
well, the last one's in Judges, but
Okay.
the book of Jasher and the book of the Wars of the Lord are mentioned in Joshua. And sometimes it's an aside. These are also like in Chronicles and Samuel, because these are all, the Deuteronomist school using the same sources. And it's like you hit an editor, like, read more about it over here. They're citing their sources.
So they were known about, but then disappeared?
They were, lost to time, Because, nerdy books that just describe stuff aren't as fun as storybooks, and we keep the storybooks.
Thank you.
Any other questions there? Okay. Here's the Bible Project video. Just a note too, our schedule almost exactly follows this. So for the next 2 weeks, we will look at this segment. Then we will look at this segment. You might notice a little difference in my schedule when we get to the conclusion, and I just don't want to forget to say this as a note. This part right here, we're going to look at it as chapter 13 through chapter 21. If you're planning to miss a week, that's a good week to miss. And you will see why when you read it. And I will also just say, I do want you to come that week, but don't feel the need to read it ahead of time, because you probably won't finish reading that segment. We will cover all that it says. You'll see why when you go and read there. It's just the list. Like, and then this tribe was here, and this tribe was here, and this tribe was here. It's really boring stuff. It even says, like, boring right there. That's why we are looking at a big segment that week, is because you don't have it as homework. I think they also mentioned that in the video. And it just so happens that our schedule lines up with the Bible Projects divisions. I had not seen this chart or watched the video when I made the schedule.
The book of Joshua. Let's back up and remember the story so far. So God chose Abraham, and then his family became the people of Israel, who are then enslaved down in Egypt. And so through Moses, God rescued Israel out of Egypt. He made a covenant with them at Mount Sinai, and he brought them through the wilderness. So Israel then camped outside the promised land, and Moses called them to obey God's commands so that they could show all the other nations what God is like. The book of Joshua picks up right after Moses has died, and Israel's ready to enter the land. So the story of Joshua is designed with four main movements. Joshua first leads Israel into the promised land, and then once they're there, they meet all this hostility from the Canaanites, and so they engage them in battle. Then after their victories, Joshua divides up the promised land as the inheritance for the 12 tribes, and then the book concludes with these final speeches that Joshua gives to the people. So let's dive in and we'll see how all of it flows together. The first section begins with Moses' death, and Joshua is appointed as Israel's new leader. And the author intentionally presents Joshua as a new Moses. So like Moses, Joshua calls the people to obey the Torah, which means the covenant commands that they were given at Mount Sinai. And then Joshua sends spies into the land, just as Moses did back in Numbers chapters 13 and 14, except it goes way better this time. In fact, even some Canaanites turn and follow the God of Israel. Joshua then leads all Israel across the Jordan River and into the land. Just like the sea parted for Moses in the Exodus, so here the river Jordan parts and the priests carry the Ark of the Covenant across, leading all Israel with them. Now, in chapter 5, the story transitions. So the people look back to their roots as God's covenant people, and so the new generation is circumcised and they celebrate their first Passover in the land. But then they turn and prepare to go forward. And Joshua has this crazy encounter with a mysterious warrior, who, it turns out, is the angelic commander of God's army. And Joshua asks, "Are you for us, or are you for our enemies?" And the warrior responds, "Neither," which shows that the real question here is whether Joshua is on God's side. It makes clear that this whole story is not about Israel versus the Canaanites. Rather, this is God's battle, and Israel is going to play the role of spectators or sometimes supporters in God's plan, which leads to the next section. We find stories about all these conflicts that Israel had with different Canaanite groups. And the first part retells the story of 2 battles in detail, and that's followed by a series of short stories that condense years of battles into a few brief summaries. So the first 2 battles are against Jericho and then Ai. And they offer these contrasting portraits of God's faithfulness versus Israel's failure. At Jericho, Israel is to take a completely passive approach. So they let God's presence in the ark lead them around the city to music for 6 days. And just like Rahab turned to the God of Israel, maybe the people of Jericho would do the same, but they don't. And so on the 7th day, the priests blow the trumpets and the walls come falling down, leading Israel to victory. The point of the story is that God is the one who will deliver his people. Israel simply needs to trust and wait. Now, the next story of the battle at Ai makes the opposite point. So there's this Israelite named Achan, and he steals from Jericho some of the devoted goods that were to belong to God alone, and then he lies about it. It's a pretty lame move after all that God has done for Israel. And so Israel goes into battle with the city of Ai, and they're totally defeated. And it's only after humble repentance and severely dealing with Achan's sin that Israel gains victory. And so together, these 2 stories, they're placed right up front to make an important point. If Israel is going to inherit the land, they have to be obedient and trust in God's commands. They don't get special treatment. Now, the second part of this section begins with the Gibeonites, a Canaanite people group, and they do just what Rahab did as they turned to follow the God of Israel and they made peace with Israel. This is in contrast to all of these other Canaanite kings who start to form alliances and coalitions, and they want to destroy Israel. So Israel engages them in battle, and they win by a landslide. And so this whole section concludes with this summary list of all of these victories won by Moses and then by Joshua. Now, let's stop for a second, because odds are that these stories and the violence in them are going to bother you. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you're bound to wonder, like, didn't Jesus say to love your enemies? Why is God declaring war here? So first, why the Canaanites? The main reasons are actually given earlier in the biblical story. Is that the culture of the Canaanites had become extremely morally corrupt, especially when it comes to sex. Go check out Leviticus chapter 18. They also widely practiced child sacrifice. Go see Deuteronomy chapter 12. And so God didn't want these practices to influence Israel. The Canaanites had to go. Which raises the second question. Did God actually command the destruction of all the Canaanites, like a genocide? So at first glance, you look at the phrases used in these stories. They totally destroyed them. They left no survivor or anything to breathe. But when you look a second time, more closely, you'll see that these phrases are clearly hyperbole and not literal. So go back to the original command about the Canaanites in Deuteronomy chapter 7. Israel is first told to drive out the Canaanites, but then to totally destroy them. And then that's followed by commands to not intermarry with them or enter into business deals with them. So you can't marry someone that you've destroyed. I think you get the point. The same idea applies to the stories in Joshua. Look closely. So for example, we're told in Joshua chapter 10 that Israel left no survivors in the cities of Hebron or Debir. But then later, in chapter 15, we see these towns and they're still populated by Canaanites. And so what we're seeing is that Joshua fits in with other ancient battle accounts by using non-literal hyperbolic language as part of the narrative style. And so the word genocide doesn't actually fit what we see here, especially in light of the stories about the Canaanites who did turn to the God of Israel, like Rahab or the Gibeonites. God was open to those who would turn to him. The last thing to think about is that these stories mark a unique moment in Israel's history. These battles were limited to the handful of people groups living in the land of Canaan. With all other nations, Israel was commanded by God to pursue peace. Go read Deuteronomy chapter 20. So the purpose of these battle stories was never to tell you, the reader, to go commit violence in God's name. Rather, they show God bringing his justice on human evil at a unique moment in history and how he delivered Israel from being annihilated by the Canaanites. Now, let's go back to the book's design. After years of battles, we see an aging Joshua, and he starts dividing up the land for the 12 tribes of Israel. And most of this section is like lists of boundary lines. And let's be honest, it's kind of boring. It's like reading a map that has no pictures. But for the Israelites, these lists were super important. This was the fulfillment of God's ancient promises to Abraham, that his descendants would inherit the promised land. And so now it was all coming to pass right down to the detail, which leads to the final section. Joshua gives two speeches to the people that are very similar to the final speeches of Moses in Deuteronomy. Joshua reminds them of God's generosity, how he brought them into the land and rescued them from the Canaanites. And so he calls them to turn away from the Canaanite gods and be faithful to the covenant they made. If they do, it will lead to life and blessing in the land. But if they're unfaithful, Israel will call down on itself the same divine judgment that the Canaanites experienced. They'll be kicked off the land into exile. And so Joshua leaves Israel with a choice. What is Israel going to do? That's the big question that looms as the story ends, and that's the book of Joshua.
Yeah.
I've always been appalled with the genocide issue and didn't have much interest in the Old Testament. But if they didn't do that, were they treated like second-class citizens with no civil rights? They couldn't have business dealings with them, intermarry. I imagine they would step up from slaves.
We'll talk about that in just a second.
Okay.
We're going to get there in just a second. Remember, though, for Joshua, remember our word of the day. It's a book that is about obedience. Moses is presented as this, Joshua is presented as this new Moses who's going to lead the people into the promised land. And it's something that they can carry with them wherever they are. So whether this book is relevant for King Josiah to help restore right worship of God, or when it's the Babylonian exile, they've lost the temple, anyone can follow God if you follow the law. That's true for Israelites. That's true for anyone else. And so I hope we'll have fun as we read the book, particularly as we look at Joshua. I'm going to give us a semi-close in prayer in case you don't want to stay for our next part, where we'll answer some of the harder questions. We'll also talk about how historians today would look at the factuality of Joshua, which is to say, if you asked most scholars, by which I mean like 99% or historians, they would not look at the conquest of Canaan as being a historical event. We will address that and how we look at that as Christians, or how you might want to look at that. But the Lord be with you. My God, we thank you for our scriptures that cause us to struggle and to ask questions and to wrestle with how we follow you here today. Be with us this day and all days, and may we be a people of obedience. Amen.
Amen.
Are y'all all wanting to stay? Oh, wow, okay. I don't know why, it surprised me last night, too. Oh, we had 8 people last night. We had some new people, that was fun, as we looked at this. So here's the disclaimer. I rearranged this because I originally had this earlier in the presentation, and I thought people might not want to stay for that, and so I put it after. But we're going to talk about sort of the genocide in here and the factuality throughout the book of Joshua. Genocide is the deliberate destruction of a people group and of their culture. That is what Joshua is. Like that's not a word that people used back when this happened or when this was written. That's a word that we use now. And that is, like, even the Bible Project video did say, like, that's not an accurate description. It is an accurate description. That is what it is. And so we're going to have just a little bit of a note about genocide. Ooh, I somehow skipped in here. So just some things to keep in mind when you come to a passage like this. Remember that this book was written a long time ago, and it has different moral values than we use today. That's important when we read things. I think it's a mistake when we go to read any book, and I start to read it in the lens that I have today, because you'll miss the point of the book. If you read a book from the Civil War, like I remember being as a young person, the language that they use in the Civil War and their ideology is different than we use today. And if you can't get past that point, you will miss the riches of any book that was written before you were alive this 1 second, because next year we'll even have different ones. And so just keep this in mind. That's not to say that things in the past were okay to do, but it was a different people that wrote them. Just some examples of this. Canaanite writings use something that they call war trophies. I will explain that picture in a second. I think I was uncomfortable when I made this, and I put lots of silly pictures in. I'll talk about that picture in a second. These war trophies, though, were ways of collecting, and so we do have from other contemporary Canaanite texts that they would go into this land, destroy all the people. The Bible Project video touched on that, but that total annihilation language in the collecting, and they're all saying that they did this to each other, and then they're all still there. And so do know that this is a style of writing, if you will, that scholars and stuff will call war trophies. And they all do this. They all talk about that as each other, and it's a way of collecting and kind of showing dominance. The other thing I just want you to note, and I have a book that will talk some about this. It'll be up in the library, and Joan already marked it with a sticky note for you, so it's easy to find, is that a lot of scholars, too, will look at when they read this. This is not to be seen as like a larger invading force coming in to a smaller, weaker force. The Canaanites were the stronger ones. They were these city-states that ruled in different areas. Sometimes they could be a little bit aggressive. We don't have that strong of a historical record, though, to say, but that the Israelites were the smaller group fighting for survival amongst these other bigger, larger city-states. That touches on some of the factuality of this, too, which we'll get to after this. But if you can lean sideways with your head, I wanted you to see the full picture. This is a real story. This house, and they built a mall and development all around it. If you've seen the book of Up or the movie Up, it's like they put the balloons on it like from that movie. This actually happened. Like this lady lived here for her whole life, and they developed all around it. She ended up becoming friends with one of the contractors, and like they kind of were almost like dating by the time she died. It's kind of a funny story. It's fun to look up. But so, this is the last stand. It's a fight for survival. It's not a fight of dominance. It's a fight for survival. The other thing to know is that we did talk about this already. The text here in Joshua is focused on covenant purity rather than ethnic identity. So just some examples of that. I already told you about Rahab. Rahab is a Canaanite who said she would turn and follow God and gets accepted into Israel. She's accepted into the covenant. Those that did not follow God, then the justice and the conquest applies to them. There's also like the Gibeonites. I'll add a caveat here. Even when you read Joshua, like you can see ideas of the layers that it was written, because in one part they're like, oh yay, we accepted the Gibeonites, and then the other part is we didn't go far enough with the Gibeonites. We shouldn't have accepted them, and it was kind of seen as a mistake. So just do take note of that too. There's also other examples. The video mentioned it, but sometimes the Israelites don't follow God, and they receive the same kind of total. It's a total purifying of the land and everything. Any questions there on that segment? Oh, thank God.
So
Okay.
killing women and children was common in those days.
Say-
Everybody did it.
Say again.
Everybody killed men, women, and children. That was the standard of war.
Yes. Yeah, lots of people died a lot of the time. So there is internal and external evidence that hints that this is hyperbolic. So it's raining cats and dogs. When we say internal evidence, that means within the book of Joshua. They gave the example of Joshua chapter 10 and Joshua chapter 15. In Joshua 10, it says this whole place was wiped out. And then in Joshua 15, it says, well, the people that were living there in those cities. That's another one of those like scholars would look at as layers of this being written at different parts. But even like within the book of Joshua, there's an idea that could be this is hyperbolic language to say totally destroyed. So maybe that only went to those who would not repent and turn to God or something like that. There's also external evidence, like we just know the Canaanites still live there. And that gets into some of the factuality of this as the book of Joshua didn't happen like it says it did if you asked historians, because we know that the Canaanites still lived for a long time. And we know that through genetic testing and other things, and it says too. The focus, though, for here is that this is about not mixing. There was this weird show I remember as a child. I don't think I was allowed to watch it, called Cat Dog. And it's this cat and a dog that are joined together onto one thing. They have. I think I was just uncomfortable when I made these slides, but they are mixed. And so this is about not mixing. Don't mix the cultures. Don't be led astray. And so they talked about that in the video too. But don't be led astray and marry with the Canaanites. Well, how do you do that if they're all dead? It doesn't, so some would say this is hyperbolic language. Without all of that, this is the focal point of this. And the part I would say to hold on to is that Joshua presents this as an establishment of God's kingdom and of God's justice. And so you could look at this. This is more than just a nationalistic agenda. A lot of very critical scholars don't like the book of Joshua. And I've noticed that too, because Joan and Joy tried to find all the library books. This is the only one that's actually about the book of Joshua, like in our Bibles. And there's one on the book of Judges. And this has nothing good to say about Joshua. This is a book that should make you question and struggle. It causes us to ask questions. What am I calling God's and what am I calling my national agenda? They're good questions to ask. There's also lots of other really, really good parts in Joshua. And I think everyone gets stuck at the uncomfortable, and it becomes hard to read the book. And I understand that because our class was going to do Joshua, when we finished Deuteronomy, and I was too uncomfortable to look at it at that time. And so, particularly to lead a class on it. And so I come back to one of my favorite stories I get to when I read Joshua is this moment with the angel. Are you on God's side, or are you trying to put God onto our side? Some scholars will criticize the book of Joshua and of what happens here, that they are kind of using God for their own nationalistic purposes. That's a question that you can ask about the text. I think the text is even aware that it could be perceived that way, and so they include a story like this on purpose. And as the Bible Project video, this is not telling you to go out and do this everywhere. It's telling us about the history of what happened here. We're going to talk about the modern scholarship in ancient Israel. If you pick up a history book, you will notice or go to a museum that modern historians and scholars do not look at a lot of the events depicted in the biblical narrative as being an accurate retelling of history. So like they will say the Exodus did not happen, at least it didn't happen in the scope in which it's described throughout the book of Exodus, and that the conquest did not happen, or at least not to the scope that it is depicted in the book of Joshua. And so we're going to talk about that here for a second. And I'm going to give you the summary of what a lot of the historians would say. Here's a topographical map of the land of Israel. Here is a satellite map, and here's the path that Joshua takes as depicted in Numbers and in the book of Joshua as they kind of go through the land. And just a few little pieces to note, so you have different people who live throughout here. This land ends up getting made by what we call the Philistines. A lot of scholars today think that the Philistines came from the Sea People, is what we call them. They were a migratory group from Greece. Whoa, man, my brain just stopped. I forgot to eat today before class, and I think that just hit me. Some place for Greek. We call it this Phoenicians. Thank you. Thank you, brain. I don't know who I said thank you to. But the Phoenicians come in. We call them the Sea Peoples. That becomes the Philistines. There's other influences from up top, and you have this tribe of different migratory groups that are all living in the area, and it changes and it morphs. We oftentimes see maps like this of the 12 tribes of Israel. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of those 12 tribes. And it depends on where you look in the Bible to see what the 12 tribes are, or even if there are 12 tribes. Because sometimes a lot of the tribes are missing, or there's even extra tribes that we don't get into this kind of traditional look. This is how it's laid out throughout the book of Joshua. Remember that Israel's in this migratory spot. It's like Knoxville. You have two big travel paths from Egypt up to the Mesopotamian Empire with Assyria, Babylon. You're also that Mediterranean down to get to Persia. And so lots of people move and mix and go in and out. Another thing to just note about the history, and so what we call the Bronze Age collapse, which was probably a large climate catastrophe. Not everyone calls this, but some people call it the Greek Dark Ages. That's a rather smaller term to use. But the reason we call it the Greek Dark Ages is the way we do history is that, if all of you spoke your own language, which would be true of the ancient world, there's no, not really usually monolithic languages throughout, unless you're trading with a very large empire. And so the way that we know what happened to all of you small little countries over there is because you traded with me, and I'm the big empire. And when something stops, when trade stops, we lose history. We don't know what happens anymore. And that's what happens here. Something happened, and all across the area, we lost records of what happens. There's probably some type of climate catastrophe. We can see climate change happening in some bubbles and lakes and stuff. It could also be a mixture of sicknesses. That also happens when big wars come. It leads to famine. And within a few generations, you'll have some type of collapse. But this was a very big collapse. And we lost stuff for centuries. We don't know what happened. When the historical record pops back up, that is when we have Israel and Judah. And so scholars sort of guess about what happened during that time. Here's one book that takes some guesses. and it is marked in the bookmark. This will be up in the library. If you really want to get into the history of what could have happened here in the book of Joshua or to these 12 tribes, they present 4 different models, what they call it, the immigration model. That is like you had people from Egypt, and then they immigrated into the area, or the conquest model, like it's depicted in Joshua. Some would call it the revolt model. If you remember, I was talking about like the city-states. Some scholars think that the Israelites were like the smaller tribes, that they already lived in the land and they are revolting their Canaanite overlords sort of thing. And there's one that's called the model of gradual evolution, because people are great at naming stuff. And that's that over time there were just tribes that lived in the area, and one of them came to call themselves the Israelites. I'm telling you all that if you're interested. I don't really like this book. It was just very mean and critical, and there was nothing good to say about Joshua in it. But there's a video that's called The Origin of the 12 Tribes of Israel from an academic point of view. It's from a group called the Useful Charts. And they share some of those views from all of those different models, essentially, and I really like them. And I'm going to show you 2 screenshots from that video. And I can send a link out in the email to this video if you're interested. But throughout the biblical narrative, like we already said, there's different mentions of the tribes. And what they kind of come up with in the video is that the idea of the 12 tribes originated in Judah, and it was already after the destruction of Israel. And this group of all of the 12 tribes, a way of thinking about it would be like they were a confederacy, and they are from different parts. So for instance, like by the way, I like this video because it combines the models and what happens in the biblical narrative in a way that makes sense in my brain. But like the Levites, we know the Levites were very Egyptian influenced. The Levites had Egyptian names. The Levites, who were the priestly class, carried a lot of the Egyptian rituals that were found in Egypt in their temples and everything like that. And that's like where Moses was from. And so the Exodus could have happened like on a smaller scale with the tribe of Levi that moved into the area. But what we know primarily from genetic testing and other history is that most of the Israelites were probably hill country Israelites. And when that collapse happened, whether it was from a climate catastrophe or disease or from war, a lot of these cities get cleaned out and the civilization structures that were there collapsed. And the hill country Israelites moved in. And you don't care about any of this. But just as a note, I'm explaining this so that if you pick up a commentary, a lot of people are very harsh, I guess, on Joshua. It makes me a little sad. And so like even this book that's like, it's an introduction to the Hebrew Bible, it says nothing positive or meaningful about the book of Joshua. And all it says is, well, this doesn't match up with history, and genocide is bad, and there's nothing positive there. So be wary of that if you pick up a commentary. That a lot of people are focused on sort of that stuff that we touched. And, oh, wow, I just realized the time. That's like 1 o'clock. That's just be wary when you pick up a commentary that a lot of people struggle with Joshua, and their struggles don't help them get past where they can see the point. And when we get to the point, just this is written for an audience here when King Josiah is helping to restore the right worship of God. And I'm gonna leave you one food for thought, is that I think Joshua serves as both an inspiration and a warning. And it's summed up in that story of the angel, whose side am I on? And so the question that you can take home with you is, how do we decipher what my own national goals or human ambitions are versus what God's call is? Remember, when we read stories from the Old Testament, the story isn't over yet. We're getting to Jesus. And Jesus is going to show us the way. And Joshua is a book that it's inspiring to see someone who followed God. It also serves as a curtail. Imagine the angel being before you, and you ask the angel, are you on my side? And the angel asks, no, are you on God's side? The Lord be with you. My God, may we be on your side, and may we learn to see the fruits of the book of Joshua and all the hidden gems. Amen.
Amen.
Come next week with chapters 1 and 2. If you have other questions about that, feel free to email me about some of the struggles of Joshua, but don't get stuck there. Yeah.
So we have the Bible as kind of a historical record of what happened during this time.